all eyes were on the 6th district, congressional district in Georgia this week, where there was last Tuesday an election to fill the seat vacated by Tom Price, the Health and Human Services Secretary. A lot of Democrats in particular were very optimistic that Jon Ossoff, their candidate for that seat, would win that race. But our next guest is from that general neck of the woods, and he had his doubts all along. Zaid Jilani is a journalist. He writes for The Intercept. Before that, he wrote at places like Think Progress and Alternet, where I have either been, depending on the outlet, published or permanently banned. And he joins us now to talk about the Georgia race. Zaid, thanks for coming back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So tell me, first of all, am I right that you knew or had a sense all along that Ossoff might not make it? And if so, why did you sense that?
Well, I think there are a few things. So first of all, that district is very historically Republican. And it's sort of difficult to see it swinging to anyone who wasn't a Republican, particularly a Democrat. We did see the performance in April where he got in a jungle primary. He did get very close to winning. But, thinking back through Georgia politics, I certainly can't think of an example where the Republicans have ever lost a runoff. And so, that was somewhat doubtful. And also, I think there's sort of a larger problem where I think a lot of the Democrats perceived him as having an advantage because Clinton very narrowly, I think it was like 1.5% in that district, won that district. And so there was a perception that this would transfer over against another Republican and for another Democrat. And I think one of the big misperceptions there is that people think that if Republicans have qualms about Trump, that therefore they'll have qualms about all the other Republicans. But that's certainly not the case. I mean, Karen Handel was a well-established Republican who had been there for quite a long time. She had been known as a moderate in Fulton County when she was in county government, and she had run for governor some years in the past and created a base. So honestly, I think she was a fairly strong candidate in that sense. I do think some parts of her campaign were weak. For instance, embracing an unpopular health care bill probably didn't help her out and probably brought Ossoff closer than he should have been able to get. But I think, from the get-go, this was a fairly sort of uphill race for him. And also, the nature of his campaign. He didn't do a whole lot to try to appeal to anyone except sort of white-collar professionals. And, there is somewhat of a tech base there and a university base there. But, speaking of that, he didn't really even talk about issues like higher education that would have produced higher youth turnout that he needed to win, or that would have won over a lot of parents who are seeing, devastating student debt among their kids, or many of them have debts themselves. So I think, a combination of factors sort of made me feel like, this was sort of Handel's race to lose, and, she pulled it off.
I think you raise a couple really important points there, Zaid. One is the notion that revulsion towards Donald Trump, which in the last year's election allowed Hillary Clinton to carry this district by a point, will translate into hostility towards other Republicans, is a false assumption. And we'll get to the substance of Ossoff's campaign in a second, but on a national level, my sense is, but I want your thoughts on it, that the Democrats have focused too much on what's horrible about Donald Trump as a human being, whether it's the reports of Russia associations or personal corruption or is just general, commonly understood horribleness, and not enough on the horribleness that the entire Republican Party represents. In a sense, I feel that they've somehow separated Trump, made him seem different from the Republican Party, whereas to me, the worst things about Trump are the most Republican things about him. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that this was also part of the strategy going back to the presidential race. I think Hillary Clinton at certain points said something to the extent of, previous Republican presidents, I didn't agree with them, but I never doubted they could do the job. And she also made a very strong pitch towards Republican voters in that sense. And I think a lot of what the Democrats were doing was to try to make Trump a larger than life personality, although he does that quite well himself. and sort of, yes, focus their policy critiques and their personality critiques towards him. And I think what a lot of them maybe misunderstood, or, whatever the case is that if you're a Republican voter, you're not suddenly going to drop your ideology because of one person who has a lot of imperfections in your mind. I mean, I know people who supported Trump, or, family, friends or stuff that supported Trump. And what I would, a lot of what you'll hear is that, yeah, Trump is one of the worst people I know, but, he'll still get it done on issues like taxes or abortion or whatever. I mean, they're almost not giving these voters enough credit because they have an ideology, right? And you have to convince them around that ideology if you want them to not vote for other Republicans. I mean, the other Republicans are fairly normal. They don't, go on Twitter and say obscene things, or, they don't try to ad-lib their speeches. They're fairly normal Republicans, and voters know that. So yeah, you can't really expect him to hurt the Republicans in that sense. I mean, I do think he's probably hurting them in the sense that some Democrats are more engaged thanks to Trump, and some Republicans may be more depressed. They might turn out in less numbers because they think his presidency is not going well. But it doesn't really turn them against other Republicans. I mean, I don't think I've seen any evidence of that. And I don't think the evidence exists, really. I think it's just an assumption that's been made because there's so much of a focus on this man and this personality.
Yeah, and I would have thought, by the way, speaking of the Ossoff Handel district, I would have thought, since that was Newt Gingrich's old district, that they're already used to gluttonous, horrible human beings, and that therefore there would have been the revulsion to Trump would have been less so than in other Republican districts. But that aside, I guess the question is then, what do Democrats need to do? They've got, they thought they had a winning formula here by putting up this guy who would be innocuous, inoffensive, wouldn't engage at all on any of the key economic issues. I mean, he rejected Medicare for all. As I understand it, he ran a lot of ads talking about how he was going to eliminate wasteful spending in Washington, which to me reinforces Republican messaging and undermines Democratic messaging. Is this more confirmation that Republican light just doesn't cut it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, I'm not in a position to give, a party political advice. Intercept's nonpartisan website and all that. But just from an analytical point of view, it seemed very clear to me that what happened with the Ossoff case, and this is something you heard a lot going up to this race, people would tell you, well, he's catering himself to his district. He's the right candidate for that district. But I'm not so sure that was true. I mean, I actually, I grew up fairly close to there. I spent first 21, 18, 19 years of my life in Cobb County before I went to college at UGA. And, I know that area fairly well, and it's really interesting. His message seemed like it was geared towards Silicon Valley. I mean, he constantly was talking about technology. He was talking about, government. He ran an entire ad talking about things like, consolidating data centers. I mean, if you look at Karen Handel's ads in her campaign, it was a fairly normal Republican ad talking about all the things Republicans care about. Whereas the things he was talking about seemed geared towards a very select, small niche group of maybe white-collar technology professionals or something, which is not the majority of that district, even though it does have some. So I think his campaign was very geared towards a certain class of people, that a certain class of consultants really are obsessed with winning over. They feel culturally attached to them. They feel like they, can bring in money, that they are more educated, so maybe they won't like some of the Republican social values. But, he ignored issues that were very important to Georgians. So, for instance, the most popular governor in Georgia's history was Zell Miller. Now, of course, Zell Miller we think of today as a very right-wing, person. But prior to him being elected to the Senate and prior to 9/11 and the Iraq War, he was known as a populist governor. And his main platform as governor of Georgia was to expand pre-K funding, K through 12 funding, and to create the Hope Scholarship and Grant, which would put people through school tuition free. He had an 85% approval rating, right? People across the state loved him. He did so much for education. The number of black students going to college doubled. That was a winning issue for Georgians and a lot of Republicans and Democrats and independents that appealed to them. John Ossoff left this issue completely on the table. I mean, this is one of the top 10 most educated districts in the entire country, actually, meaning they have a lot of people in school or who went to school. Student debt would be a huge issue for them. And John Ossoff was a candidate who was 30 years old. To me, it takes an incredible amount of consultant and pollster brainwashing for someone to ignore the main issue in your own peer group, right? And that's not a matter of saying, some people would push back on me saying, well, are you saying if he was a far leftist or a complete Bernie person that he was going to win a conservative-leaning district? I never said anything like that. I just said that you have to, when you're doing politics, it works best when you're talking about issues that actually impact people's lives. Whereas with this case, I think they tried to create a composite of someone who's not offensive, who just, tries to appeal to everyone, but doesn't necessarily turn out everyone. It doesn't necessarily actually speak to the lives that people are living. And I think by leaving an issue like education on the table that has been so compelling for Georgians for so long when the Democrats were successful there, it showed me that his campaign actually was not geared very well towards the district.
I think that's a great point. And we're talking with Zaid Jilani, journalist for The Intercept. And don't worry, Zaid, we are nonpartisan here. And this is analysis. This is not, party playing party favorites here. But that said, I get that you're not necessarily saying he needs to run as a Bernie Democrat or whatever. But it does seem to me that a heavy dose of populism might have helped this guy turn out the disaffected base. I just wonder how many laboratory experiments the Democratic Party needs in running this kind of candidate in different parts of the country before they conclude that, maybe this isn't working so well. I wonder, how many more state houses have to be lost or whatever. Is there a lesson here? I mean, I love what you're saying, very insightful about the specifics of this district, but to the extent that you've watched national politics overall, are there national lessons to be taken out of this, you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. So actually, this wasn't the only special election that occurred this week for Congress. There's also one in South Carolina to replace Mick Mulvaney, who's Trump's budget chief. And actually, in that race, the Democrat got closer to winning than Ossoff did in Georgia, which is really interesting. Now, the Democrat in South Carolina, I wouldn't say as much of a populist. He's actually a Goldman Sachs alumni. But it's interesting. If you watch his ads that he ran, if you look at his platform, he did make an attempt actually to appeal to people's lives more and not just to put out, non-offensive rhetoric or whatever Ossoff was doing. For instance, he was very strong saying we can't cut Social Security. He was very much into negotiating for lower drug prices and importing drugs from Canada. He was talking about, corporate tax unfairness and how they use tax loopholes and things like that. I mean, he actually had at least a set of issues that would appeal to people who are in the working class and the middle class, right? He wasn't just trying to turn out a sliver of really rich people or swing them away from the Republican Party. And he actually ended up doing better with a small sliver of the resources. I mean, Ossoff had over $20 million spent on him. Actually, that overall race was the most expensive race in the history of the House of Representatives, which is amazing because it was a race basically about nothing that didn't advance the politics of the district at all, that didn't, engage or incite people or even really make any real ideological points, which is, says something about what money in politics does. But, and we've also seen a number of other races in Kansas and Montana where candidates also were running uphill. They also lost, but they got closer than Ossoff, and they made a real point of it. They really did advance a different kind of politics that gears towards working people, towards populism in their districts while doing it, whereas Ossoff lost, and he really didn't advance a different type of politics at all. I doubt anyone is ever going to remember any campaign plank that he campaigned on. So I think there's something to be said also for losing, but while you lose, your loss was about something. When you have a loss that's not about anything and it's just a waste of money, I think there's a lot less lessons to be drawn from that.
Yeah, it's very well said, and it's a great point. And on the last kind of topic, the candidate you mentioned in South Carolina, Archie Parnell, well, as you say, he didn't exactly run a populist campaign. His style was very unconsultant-y and unscripted. He, as you say, he talked about the issues that affect people in his district. It raises a question, does all this money from outside and all the consultant input and so on that comes with it. That might be hurting the Democrats, right?
Look, I think ultimately the Democrats and the Republicans, given the resources they have, they believe they have to fundraise against each other. And they believe that by doing that fundraising, they'll be able to run 30-second ads, smearing each other, and that's how they're going to win. And, there's a logic to that, but there's also a logic to saying when you're raising so much money, you're spending time in, ballrooms listening to really rich people all the time, or you're spending time going around the country listening to some of the, the upper crust of America. You're not spending time talking to people. You're not spending time talking to the person who might give you $27, as Bernie Sanders did, who might be a teacher, a social worker, a nurse, so on and so forth. And I think that creates a politics that a lot of people just don't want to engage in. One of Hillary Clinton's campaign staffers said that Ossoff was doing a quote-unquote Panera Bread strategy. Panera Bread is kind of an upscale chain restaurant. It's really interesting. Jeff Stein from Vox went around that district. He went to Panera Breads and talked to people, and it was mostly Republicans. And then he went to a Waffle House, and he talked to a Waffle House employee who was in his uniform. And the Waffle House employee said, I don't want to vote because this system is corrupt and these people don't care about me. And that's the other thing that happens when you create a system that's so obsessed with fundraising, is people look at that and they see it for what it is. They see you catering to people for that money, and then they cater to them in your governing and your policy. So, that's a huge disadvantage to how the U.S. funds its elections, and particularly how the Democratic Party is gearing itself. And I think if they moved away from that, if they and the Republicans moved away from that, they could create an entirely new type of politics where more people will be voting, more people feel represented. And yeah, you couldn't run as many 30-second ads smearing the other person, but maybe you could actually have a politics of community engagement where people feel valued. And I think that's what Ossoff was missing.
I think that's a great way to put it. And the only thing I have to add is that I like waffles a lot more than I like Panera Bread. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Zaid Jilani, journalist for The Intercept, great to talk to you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you.